Okay, good morning, everyone, and good to see all of you here virtually. And welcome to this public policy dialogue series, which features Professor Anthony Cheung. And I'm Dr. Alex He. I'm currently the associate head of the APS department at EdUHK. It's a great pleasure to be the moderator of the talk today. And we have chosen a highly interesting topic, housing affordability, here today. And we have invited Professor Anthony Cheung, the former Secretary for Housing and Transport of Hong Kong SAR government, and then Professor Donald Low, the Professor of Practice of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology here, and both of them will be sharing their great insights. And then in the public policy language, we have a special term called wicked problem. The problems are very hard to define, intertwined, and thorny and difficult to solve. And then housing has been one of the, the wicked problems, especially in Hong Kong, and which, the problem is also plaguing many other parts of the world, especially in Asia. And today, we have, I think nobody else, is in such a authoritative position to talk about housing other than Professor Anthony Cheung, and who was the Housing and Transport Minister of Hong Kong. And Professor Donald Low, he's based in Hong Kong, but he's a Singaporean. And then, the Singapore HDB model is, so famous as worldwide well known. And so they will be sharing with us lots of their insights. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Cheung to kick off this talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Given my former experience as the Secretary for Transport Housing, I hope I will not be too biased in the way I discuss the topic. As what Alex has just said, housing is one of the wicked problems. Now, it's simple to define as a problem because we know, okay, prices have gone up, rents have gone up, and we don't have sufficient units in supply. But it's so difficult to diagnose the problem because it's so multifaceted, so complex an issue. So my role today is to look at the problem and to see how wicked it is. So let me start by some general observations. Now, it's all a matter of supply and demand. And Hong Kong's housing problem is caused by severe supply shortage versus very solid demand. And demand is not just user demand, but also investment demand from local people, and then a small portion from overseas buyers. And the funny thing about the housing market is that people buy when prices go up. People don't buy when prices go down. So if prices go down and people don't buy, you have excess supply. And then the suppliers will reduce the supply. And then when it comes to a rebound, then you have a big problem, because supply cannot catch up with the rising demand. And therefore, we have to tackle the problem on both the supply side and the demand side. The market itself is not just caused by real demand and real supply levels, because people buy with some expectations, or prices will depend on expectations. And therefore, in terms of any measures to contain the prices, you have to work on the market expectations. And right now, of course, even in Hong Kong today, when we have gone through some social and political unrest, but still the market seems to be quite resilient. So we can see how complex the problem is. Now let's have a look at Hong Kong's housing situation. I don't want you to look at all the details, but just to highlight a few points. In terms of the ratio of our population, or the housing stock households between the private market and the public rental sector, and you can see that we are roughly 50-50, with a slightly greater portion in the private sector. Now, but prices and rental levels including per capita accommodation or living space, is so different between the public and the private sector. In the private sector, if you look at average rent, and here I highlight the rent level in the new territories as example, and you can see that if you are in public rental housing, PRH, then you are very lucky compared to someone living in a private sector unit. But in terms of space, actually, you have more space in the public rental housing sector compared to the private sector. In the public rental housing sector, the per capita living space using IFA, internal floor area, per capita overall, 13.4 square meters. Whereas for the private sector, for most ordinary people, roughly, according to some estimate by NGOs, about 50 square meters. So that's roughly 4.6, or let's say 5 square meters. So you can see the strong contrast. And that's why if we really want to solve Hong Kong's pressing housing affordability problem, then the simple answer seems to be you work on public rental housing. That seems to be the most direct response. Of course, it's more complicated than that. In terms of prices, and you can see if in the public sector, subsidized housing, HOS, or the green form subsidized housing, roughly 30 to 50% discount against to the market price. So that's the situation we are now in. Now let's look at the trend in terms of prices and rentals. Now, property prices in Hong Kong have been on the upward trend almost continuously since 2008 and 2009. So that's roughly the time of the global financial crisis. At that time, people were expecting prices to plummet. People were expecting a collapse, another collapse of the property market in Hong Kong, because back in 1998, 1999, when the Asian financial crisis occurred, there was a collapse of the property market. Prices went down by almost 70%. But funny enough, the global financial crisis in 2008 to 9 saw the beginning of a continuous period of a rise in prices, almost non-stop, even until today. Now let's look at rent. Now, rental level has sort of steadied in the last few years and gone down a little bit, but still is high compared to people's affordability. So that's the situation Hong Kong is in. But it is not just, okay, another slide about the housing affordability problem. According to Demographia, which is an organization that conducts annual survey of housing affordability in different cities, Hong Kong has been ranked the world's least affordable housing market for many years. And the latest survey result, which was just announced a few days ago, indicates that we have a median multiple of 20.7 compared to 20.8 last year. So still very high. We are number one in the world in terms of the least affordable housing market, followed by Vancouver, Sydney. These are all cities which have experienced housing bubbles in the last few years. And according to Demographia, their observation, the deterioration in housing affordability represents an existential threat to the middle class households. Why middle class? Middle income households. Why middle income? Because most of the time, these households, they cannot, or they are not eligible for subsidized housing, which is primarily geared towards the grassroots. And yet they are not rich enough to afford private housing. So they are squeezed in between. And the same situation in Hong Kong. Higher housing costs relative to incomes are strongly correlated with higher overall cost of living, and therefore lower standards of living. And that is a major source of social discontent among the middle class. So that's, I remember at the last policy dialogue, when we discussed the theory of young people, we referred to this perceived trend of downward social mobility among young middle class people. But Hong Kong is not unique in terms of facing a housing affordability crisis. Now here, as an example, I am citing a report, a recent report from the OECD, okay, and on housing affordability. And according to the report, on this OECD report, in the European Union, prices in housing had increased dramatically. That's the word used in the report, in OECD countries over the past decade, especially for renters, and the supply of affordable housing has failed to meet demand. Now, people would say, okay, in Germany, they have a very stringent regime, rental control regime. But even in Germany, new rentals, the rents have gone up. And that's why recently they have introduced a very stringent measure to prevent or to make sure the rent will not go up within the next 5 years. You cannot increase rent for the landlords. But that measure apparently is still subject to legal challenge. On average, people in OECD countries now spend nearly 22% of their disposable income. But for lower income renters, actually they spend 40%, 1 in 3 of these low income renters spend 40%, over 40% of their income to pay rent. So you can see the seriousness of the problem. The third bullet here, rising housing prices make it more difficult for people to get on the property ladder. Now the same situation in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is unique, is not unique, but perhaps the situation is much more acute compared to many other cities like London, Sydney, and some other big cities. So we have the situation before us. So what's behind the situation? The culprit of soaring property prices. And here I try to highlight some perceptions, allegations, and then how I look at the situation. Allegation 1, unrestrained housing prices over the past decade were a result of poor and defective government policies. Now, I will not defend government policy per se here, particularly because I was one of those responsible for the policy from 2012 to 17. But I would like to point to the reality that since 2009, right, during the global financial crisis, Hong Kong, like other big cities, London, Sydney, Vancouver, Toronto, or mainland cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing, had all been suffering from property bubble induced by volatile global economic environment with cheap credit, extremely low to zero interest rate because of QE, and speculative financial capital. There's a lot of money around the world, and money looks for opportunities, and somehow brick and mortar is regarded as a safer form of that kind of investment, or where you place your capital. As far as bubble cities are concerned, sometimes we are not aware of some bubble cities which actually are quite serious. Now, let me give you some examples. In 2013, there was already the bubble phenomenon. And some cities were named at the time, and even though people in Hong Kong are not fully aware of that, San Francisco, Vancouver, Toronto, we know this. And then 2015 to 17, okay, because I cut off in 2017, that's when I left the government. Apart from Hong Kong, Toronto, Vancouver, we also have Stockholm, Munich, which were among the bubble cities. So it's quite widespread in terms of a phenomenon. And I would say mostly because of the abundance of financial capital and cheap credit, QE at the time, and until now, of course. Allegation number two, the government has not worked hard enough to secure land for housing development. Now, later on, I'll explain the land challenge. But the reality I would like to point out at this point is that government is only as effective as the public allows it to get land. Because in terms of land, we need to go through the planning process, we need to go through district consultation, and it's not just Hong Kong, but some other cities, there is also a very strong resistance to development. I remember once during my days as minister, I met my counterpart from, I think, from Sweden. And then I mentioned to this minister from Sweden, who was responsible for planning, I said, well, in Hong Kong, we have this land supply problem. Wherever we want to find land, there is local resistance, a lot of opposition. And then imagine how he responded to me. He said, oh, even Hong Kong has this problem. So in other words, Sweden had a problem at the time. And I could never imagine that Sweden, I mean, we are talking about the Scandinavian countries, we thought they're not so densely populated, and it's easier to find land, but they face the same problem. This NIMBYism, not in my backyard mentality, actually is quite widespread, quite common. So it depends on how you persuade people, your population, to accept some policy directions or choice in terms of getting more land, how to overcome hurdles. Some of them are institutional, some of them are political. But at this point, if we look forward, I think we probably expect the global economic situation to remain volatile and actually quite mixed, because on the one hand, we have the uncertainty, US-China Cold War, COVID-19, and then QE still in place. So it's a mixture, because when you have economic and political uncertainty, probably you expect the market to react to such uncertainties, and therefore the housing market may not be as vigilant as before. But at the same time, you have QE measures, you have cheap credit, so it's a rather mixed situation. In the case of Hong Kong, we still have the impact of the political and social unrest of the last couple of years. But when we see the housing market, actual housing market continues to hold firm. So it's a very complicated, not easy to fully explain situation. But for any government, what you want to see are not serious ups and downs, because ups and downs, whether prices go up or prices go down dramatically, are disastrous, will create a lot of discontent and uncertainty from different angles. So Hong Kong, because of the external economic and financial environment that Hong Kong cannot control, and domestically, because of the very stringent situation in terms of increasing land supply, particularly if you want to increase supply quickly, it's not easy. And local community reaction, NIMBYism, our long planning process, and sometimes, in my view, our narrow-sighted politics are compounding supply difficulties. But in respect of these challenges, constraints and hurdles, I think any government in power must demonstrate the will to solve the problem. But the government cannot just solve the problem by its will. It has to persuade people, it has to get the buy-in, it has to go through the process, a very challenging, sometimes time-consuming process. But still, government has to press ahead. Okay, let me quickly go through some of the measures introduced over the last several years. Now, during the last administration, the Leung administration, 2012 to 17, I think the most notable measure was the launch of the 2014 long-term housing strategy. That was a result of over a year's public consultation and internal discussion by a steering committee. And that long-term housing strategy, which is still being continued by the current administration, reversed the 2002 housing policy retreat. Because of the Asian financial crisis, the government at that time decided that government should withdraw from the housing market in terms of supply of housing for sale. So therefore, there was a retreat in the home ownership scheme. There was a retreat, so to speak, in terms of selling more land. And now looking back, perhaps that retreat was too drastic compared to the subsequent demand situation. And in the 2014 long-term housing strategy, there were several breakthroughs in terms of policy. First, it set the vision of adequate and affordable housing. Now, how do you define adequate and affordable? There's no worldwide benchmark. It depends on different national and domestic contexts. But in terms of Hong Kong, I remember because people, legislators asked me the question, and at that time I replied by saying, well, let's look at public rental housing. Let's use public rental housing as the benchmark for adequate and affordable housing. The second breakthrough, a supply-led strategy, supply in terms of supplying land, supplying housing units. You have a plan so that people know that more housing units will be forthcoming, and therefore there is more leverage in terms of suppressing or containing housing prices. And for the first time, that 2014 long-term housing strategy introduced a 60-40 public-private split in terms of new housing supply. Prior to that, in government for several decades, there was no clear indicator of the target in terms of public housing split, public-private split. So for the first time, that target was introduced. And then a 10-year supply target with annual updating so that people know what to expect. But of course, the challenge has been if the 10-year supply target based on demand, based on need, is stipulated, and if the expected supply level cannot catch up with demand, that might create a reverse kind of expectation. People would worry even worse, and then you have more sort of purchase because of that kind of expectation. In the long-term housing strategy, it was also emphasized that public housing is the priority, and therefore we have to do more, including the including assisted home ownership, such as the HOS and subsequently the green form subsidized housing scheme. Now, apart from the long-term housing strategy, there were several rounds of demand management measures by way of special stamp duty. And those measures were not meant to suppress prices as what some media at that time speculated. Because when the market goes up, no matter what government does, you cannot contain, you cannot really push prices down. it is still necessary for the government to do something to curb market exuberance, because the feature of the housing market is once prices have gone up, prices will, it will be so hard for prices to go down, because the consequences will be so severe, prices will stay at a high level. So it's better for government not to allow prices to go up and to achieve some kind of soft landing. Now, then from 2017 onwards until now, we have the Lam administration looking after Hong Kong. The housing shortfall continues to haunt the government. The government set up a task force on land supply, and over a year's time in consultation, hoping to find some social consensus on different ways of increasing land supply. But unfortunately, the society seems to be as split as ever, as divided as ever over different measures. There's no measure which has received wide public support. Every measure is objective in some way, in some quarters. But the government decided to revise the public-private split to 70-30 for new housing supply. In other words, more new land available will be devoted to the building of public housing, whether for rent or for sale. Now, in my view, that's the right direction. But of course, the challenge remains, how do you get the land? And you cannot, at the same time, while you are increasing land for public rental housing or for sale, you cannot create the impression that from now onwards, there will be a drastic cut in private land supply, housing supply, because that will create an impact on the housing market. So therefore, the government has to be quite careful in terms of balancing expectations. The current administration has also launched the Tomorrow Land Tower Vision in major reclamation to make land. That is, I think, in the right direction. Of course, there is controversy regarding the scale of the reclamation, how government can finance the reclamation project. The government has also indicated support to NGOs in the provision of transitional social housing projects. I think that is something in the right direction, but the challenge remains that the amount of social housing to be made available will remain to be quite small compared to the huge demand, as indicated by the population in subdivided units. There was an attempt to introduce some kind of vacancy tax on fresh left unsold on rented for 6 months, but that proposal has now been shelved because of, at that time, the reaction within the Legislative Council. The government has started a feasibility study on rent control, not a whole-scale rent control scheme, but rent control for subdivided units. But that requires legislation, and the government has yet to come up with the final report on how feasible that is. I think rent control is, of course, something that can be considered, but we must ensure that it can be passed, it's doable and enforceable. And the last bullet point here, government has also introduced a cash subsidy scheme for public rental housing applicants waiting for more than 3 years. But that refers to PRH applicants on a general application list, not including the QPS applicants. QPS representing quota and points system, which is applied to singletons, single applicants. Many of them, they are young people. Okay, let's look at the fundamental problem, land supply. Now, I'm going to make some comments on some of the perceptions about how to increase land or why land is not available in a particular way. Myth number one, there is enough land for more housing, such as idle brownfield and agricultural land in private hands, only if government has the will to proceed with statutory resumption. Reclamation is not necessary. The reality is, even if you have a lot of brown land available, which is not necessarily the case in Hong Kong, because a lot of brown land, they are not idle land. You have business like car storage, repair, light storage, car repair, or recycling, and with taking over, resuming brown land, you still have to have some measures to compensate the landowners. It's not the case that most brown land are in private hands, in government hands. In fact, a lot of brown land is in private hands. So the challenge is the same as in agricultural land or other forms of resumption. You still need to make sure you have appropriate clearance and compensation schemes available. So the challenge is there. So my comment is reclamation actually is unavoidable. It may not be the main or the only solution, but it's unavoidable, particularly if you would like to have a large supply of new land. Myth number two, because we have the small house policy for new territories, indigenous inhabitants. And people assume that because of this scheme, a lot of land has been assigned for use as small house development for the new territories, indigenous inhabitants. I think that's probably an exaggerated assumption. The reality is this small house policy, which was introduced since the 1970s by the former British administration for anti-indigenous inhabitants. This scheme is subject to a lot of restrictions. It's subject to application and approval. And approval rate actually is not high. The number here, this is according to government statistics, between 2008 to 2017, 11 years, okay? Only less than 10,000 units of small house developments were approved. So in other words, less than 1,000 units per year. Now compared to the current demand and supply situation in Hong Kong, that is a very meager number, okay? So even if you don't approve all these small house applications, you can't solve the problem. So that's my point. It's not as serious of a large scale as people assume. And there are a lot of other restrictions regarding what kind of land you can use for small house applications. Now here I would like to let the audience know the site that can be used must be within the V zone and the environs or the village extension area of a recognized village, and not every piece of land can be defined that way. And the site must be one which is not affected by any impending development and does not prejudice any future planning or development proposals. A lot of land in the new territories has been planned for other purposes. And once planned for other purposes, you can't use the land for small housing. High land price policy of government has driven up prices. Okay? That's a general assumption. But the reality is, the government policy in principle is to determine land price according to the market supply and demand. So in other words, the highest bidder will get the land, and then the prices will be at that level. But of course, one can argue, why can't government sell land very cheaply? But the point is, even if government sells the land very cheaply, the final product, the housing units built, are still subject to the market supply and demand situation. if the demand for housing units is high, prices will still remain high in terms of products. So even if you sell the flour very cheaply, it doesn't mean the bread will be sold cheaply, because we are facing different market situation. There is a suggestion in the recent months that we should ask the Central People's Government to help Hong Kong by giving land from the mainland, including some sites in Shenzhen, to Hong Kong to build public housing. I think that is perhaps not a wise move, because first of all, it would defeat the Hong Kong people governing Hong Kong or self-administration spirit. You have your domestic problem, you try to solve the problem domestically using your high degree of autonomy. You cannot just expect your neighboring partners to let you have land, because they have the land and housing challenges as well. And by doing, if we really proceed along that route, it will actually invite ill feeling from the mainland people and officials. And that may not be too beneficial to Hong Kong. And thirdly, even if you've got the land, you still need to provide for very costly transport and other infrastructures, because the land is not within Hong Kong. Okay, a few words about demand management. I know I'm running short of time, so I'll try to be quick here. A number of demand management measures were introduced during the period 2012 to 17. Now, people wondered whether these measures were effective. As I said before, these measures were not meant to suppress prices. These measures were meant to contain market exuberance, to make sure that prices would not go up as quickly as they could if you don't have these measures. So ensure there's some soft landing. At that time, there was still market expectation that at some point, the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board in the US, will allow interest rate to go up again so that the market situation might change. Of course, later on, we can see, looking back, actually, QE has remained a steady measure under Fed. Now, there was this assumption in the past that non-local buyers, particularly mainland buyers, have pushed up the property markets. Now, I'm not denying the impact of non-local purchase, but the reality, let's look at the figures. Because of the introduction of special stamp duties, we have the buyer's stamp duty, BSD, which applies only to non-local buyers. According to some statistics, this is, I think, still the situation, rough situation now. Only 1.5% of all first-hand and second-hand property transactions have paid BSD. So the numbers, the ratio is not high at all. Now, of course, one could argue, maybe there are cases where you have non-local buyers buying through local proxies. I don't think the situation will be that serious. I mean, there's a high ratio of such cases. And there's also this myth that because of the introduction of demand management measures, particularly the stamp duty aiming at short-term speculation, because there's a special stamp duty on any sale within 2 to 3 years, that hinders the landlords from putting the properties to the market. But that constraint or that that restriction will only apply in the initial years, because once you're in a regular cycle, every year you have so-called landlords liberated from the withholding restriction. So the number of units will continue to be supplied to the market. There is this hearsay that the demand management measures have not been effective. Now let's look at the situation in Hong Kong. At least I can put it, say it on record, from the third quarter of 2015 to roughly the middle of 2016, within that 9 months, actually housing prices in Hong Kong went down by nearly 10%, 9-point-something%, compared to continued rise in other big cities like London and Shenzhen at that time. And in 2013, there was a paper by the Bank of International Settlement, which considered various measures of curbing market exuberance. And that BIS paper concluded that actually the kind of measures introduced by Hong Kong and Singapore at that time to tax property transactions actually was, on balance, the more effective measures. Counter-cyclical prudential measures introduced by the Hong Kong MA, the Monetary Authority, that this would make it more difficult for young people to borrow mortgage loans because the loan amount would be smaller, and make it difficult for people to save enough to pay the down payment. Now that's true. I mean, that restriction definitely has that impact. But the reality is, if the HKMA is not prudential enough, and if banks just extend loans easily, Hong Kong would easily have a replication of the 1998-1999 Asian financial crisis situation. And I think, on balance, the HKMA has to ensure the stability of the banking system. Now, that's a very difficult choice, and that's a paradox that the government has to face. Okay, now, what can we do? There are some suggestions apart from, ultimately getting more land for public housing, for private housing. There is a suggestion that we should make tenants, here we are mainly talking about public housing tenants, flat owners, let them buy their property. Like in the British Safe Council Housing Scheme, in Hong Kong since 1997, there was a scheme known as the Tenant Purchase Scheme, the TPS, or even HOS for the public housing tenants. They can buy HOS first using the green form. But the point is the timing. At the moment, we have a serious shortage of public rental housing units. Long queue, over 250,000 people queuing for public rental housing. Now, in this kind of tight supply situation, if government say, tell people, actually we allow public rental housing tenants to buy their flat at a huge discount, like the TPS before, because the TPS in the initial years actually offered a discount to as much as 70% the market price. Now, what will be the political consequence? Why are PRH tenants given this privilege? Because unlike Singapore, Hong Kong is not yet in a situation where anyone of a certain age can actually get a unit by waiting for a few years. So we still have a huge shortage. So the economic advantage that can be gained from any public rental sales scheme has to be balanced with other repercussions, social and political repercussions. And the TPS has not worked effectively before, mainly because when at that time, the Housing Authority allowed the tenants to have the choice whether they would like to remain as tenants or buy the unit. And some of them, about 30%, mainly elderly tenants, they prefer to be renters. And therefore, you have this kind of mixed tenure of a single block. 30% tenants, 30% owners. then it's very delicate in terms of management. For the tenants, the housing authority is still managing the units. For the other 70%, landowners, they have, I mean, the whole block actually is meant by a management committee. And a lot of debate as to how to deal with the tenants in these blocks, which are already TPS blocks. And a problem which has not yet emerged, but will emerge definitely, is by the time it is necessary to redevelop the block, then you have tenants and owners having different views. So any sale of public housing would be more feasible if the whole block is sold. That will involve a different scheme, not the previous TPS scheme. Short-term solutions, rent control, rent subsidy assistance. These are good intentions, but we have, of course, to balance the politics with the economics, because most economic analysis has suggested that once you have rent control, the quality of housing block might deteriorate. The landlords will have less incentive to maintain the quality of the blocks. And the landlords would tend to ask for higher rent because they know once they have taken on board the tenants, it will be so difficult to increase the rent. So higher rent, asking rent will go up, and landlords will be more choosy. So some underprivileged people or some ethnic minorities may find difficult to find units that will be rented to them. So there will be consequences that we have to factor in. So the next suggestion then from those advocates of rent control is, okay, we don't have this blanket rent control scheme, why don't we just focus on SDUs, subdivided units? And that's exactly what the current government is trying to explore. Now, I will not comment on whether some effective measures can be worked out, but I just want to highlight the kind of balancing we have to go through. Rent subsidy. Rent subsidy is good if we are not in a very tight tenancy supply situation. But given the very tight tenancy supply situation, any rent subsidy that will enable renters to pay more, to afford to pay more, will actually give the landlords the incentive to ask for more rent. So it might result in the transfer of benefits to the landlords, because the landlords know that the tenants have got an extra few thousand from government to pay rent. So again, we have to see whether the government's recent scheme, cash subsidy scheme, will result in rentals moving up. But if government can have some measures to ring fence the impact of some limited form of rent control and some limited form of rent subsidy, I think this is still something that should be considered. Transitional housing. Now, I won't go into details, and I know the current administration is helping some NGOs to provide social housing projects. But the point which I would like to make is, even if government is very active in supporting NGOs in doing this, but the number of transitional housing units remain to be very small, maybe a few thousand or 10,000. But compared to the current population living in inadequate housing, and 122,000, this figure is from government. 90,000 of them are in subdivided units. So we still face a huge number of households who cannot benefit from any form of transitional housing. So government still needs to do more in terms of public rental housing. And also, government cannot abolish subdivided units. Subdivided units are not ideal accommodation, but still accommodation. So that's the dilemma faced by the government. Can government regulate subdivided units? I think yes. Actually, government can regulate and set a lot of requirements regarding hygiene, sanitary situation. But unfortunately, when we did the public consultation for the long-term housing strategy in 2013, in fact, government did not receive support to regulate subdivided units. Even those concerned groups who care for the welfare of people living in subdivided units, they did not support regulation. Okay, finally, can we go the Singapore way? I think in terms of policy vision, we can, and probably we should, meaning we give more priority to public housing. But we have to pay attention to the starting point. At this point, we have sort of half of the population living in public and private housing, slightly more in private housing. In Singapore, they have 80% living in public housing. So how can we move from the current 46% of people living in public housing to 80%? I don't think we can do that within a few years. We probably need a generation's time. And assuming we have the land for public housing, but we cannot allocate 100% of the new land to public housing, because if we do that, that would send a very bad message to the private market, and private housing prices will go up, private housing rents will go up. So we have to move step by step on a more gradual basis, and that takes time. So even going the Singapore way, if assuming we have a policy consensus, philosophical consensus, we still cannot expect a quick win situation. Okay, so that's the challenging situation we are facing. So my conclusion at this point is that there is no quick fix. We have to have a multi-pronged approach. Every means possible, we do something, hoping that added together, the housing situation can still improve. But in the process, we have to bear in mind, no pain, no gain. And that's a difficult thing for the community. Now, a few points are here. Secure as much developable land as possible. Land resumption, reclamation, including land title reclamation, increasing the plot ratio or density, rezoning, engaging in comprehensive development plans in the new territories, and even using some limited country park fringe lands, assuming that these lands, because they're closer to the developed area, you don't need to spend a lot of money and time in terms of infrastructure. And if you use fringe lands, those lands must be used for public housing to benefit, let's say, the elderly or some young people. So we try every means to find more developable land. Second point, press ahead on all fronts, because we know that on a longer term basis, Hong Kong still will face a housing need problem, particularly if we try to go the Singapore way. So we have to give time for planning, for the planning process, and it takes a lot of time. If we look at the past, sometimes a development may take more than a decade or 1.5 decades to materialize. Because of all these complications, we have to allow time. To go through the process, we have to be persistent. Meanwhile, no harm to try some short-term stopgap measures, but we have to be aware that these are short-term, these are not the fundamental solutions. And we have to be careful about any social and political consequences. For example, rent control, how extensive it should be. Bear in mind the experience in other countries about landlords, how they react to rent control measures, whether that will result in deteriorating housing stock. Public housing as priority. I think we should continue with that direction. And I also agree that we should encourage well-off public rental housing tenants to buy public housing flats. So the current green form subsidy scheme, I think, should continue. It can be expanded. Contain price instability in the public market. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should introduce more demand management measures at this point. I'm just flagging this up as a general point. Because while you're waiting for more supply, in the meanwhile, don't allow prices to go up too drastically. Because once prices have gone up, it will come down very slowly, unless you have a world economic crisis. Long-term housing vision, yes, I think I would favor some kind of quasi-Singapore version, but still, land supply, land supply, land supply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cheung, for this highly exciting talk. And in particular, I think he has dispelled some commonly held myth that is many people actually believe. And then I found that part of the talk mostly informative and exciting. And then I know we have received 2 questions in the Q&A box, but let's leave this to the end, and then we'll collect all the questions at one go. So now let's move to the second speaker, Professor Donald Low, and he will be sharing with us the Singapore model. Donald, please.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I also want to thank Professor Cheung for really laying out the very vexatious and complex problem that Hong Kong faces in meeting its housing housing challenge. And you also addressed the point about how there is no quick fix, right? That whatever solution there is really relies on a complex set of factors coming together, and that the Singapore model, which to most observers works much better, much more comprehensive, much more efficient in solving the housing problem, is not easily available to Hong Kong, right? Because of very different institutional and legislative contexts. So I've lived in Hong Kong for more than 2 years now, and so I've visited many public housing estates. And from a visual level, at least, I can observe 3 main differences between public housing in Hong Kong and public housing in Singapore, and more generally housing as well, not just public housing. The first, of course, is, as you pointed out, public housing in Singapore is a lot more comprehensive, right? 46% in Hong Kong, 80% in Singapore. The other point, of course, is in Singapore, most public housing would be in the form of homeowners, right? 90% of people who live in public housing do so as homeowners. And most times people look at this and immediately their conclusion is, therefore, the Singapore state is more effective, right, in delivering public housing. Yes, it is certainly more efficient, but as you pointed out, that's a function more of the environment and the context, right, institutional and legislative context. And you highlighted the importance of securing available land, developable land. And that's the key difference, I think, between Hong Kong and Singapore. The Singapore government is far less constrained, far less encumbered in having the legislative tools to obtain land, whereas the Hong Kong government faces far more constraints. The second big difference I observe, and this is in Hong Kong's favor, is that public housing estates here are much denser, much more compact, and therefore better served by, and more well connected, right, by public transport in particular, not just your excellent MTR system, but also by buses. The third big difference is diversity. And I noticed public housing estates here are far better integrated with commercial developments, with a mix of public and private. Whereas in Singapore, it tends to be, if you have a large public housing estate, it's just mostly public housing estate, right? It's just mostly public housing. So it can be, and some public housing estates can be rather homogeneous, can resemble a ghost town during working hours. So it's not all gloomy. It's not that in all respects public housing in Singapore is superior in Hong Kong. In many respects, in some respects at least, public housing in Hong Kong has a lot to be said about it. So let me say something about how Singapore views public housing. The first thing to note is that public housing serves multiple objectives in Singapore. First and foremost, it is seen as a way of creating a sense of nationhood, a sense of belonging. and hence the emphasis on home ownership rather than rental, pretty much right from the start. I mean, public housing in Singapore started as rental, but very quickly they switched to a home ownership model. The second is that public housing is seen as an instrument for socio-economic as well as ethnic integration, and I'll speak more about that. Thirdly, very importantly, I think, much more so in Singapore than Hong Kong, is that public housing was a key instrument of land redistribution. Singapore, compared to other developed countries, does not have a comprehensive welfare state, right? There is no unemployment insurance, there are no universal pensions, even our retirement security is based on our own savings. But the key difference is that, or the key element of Singapore's welfare state, if I can call it that, is public housing, right? And it differs from conventional welfare states in that it is not, public housing is not a cash transfer. It is an asset transfer, it's a wealth transfer, right? Involving the provision of an asset, right? In the form of a public flat. And most people don't appreciate that, right? So they don't realize how central public housing is to Singapore's provision of social security. Public housing is also an instrument of land reform, because beginning in the early 1960s, the Singapore state, using its legislative power in the form of the Land Acquisition Act, would acquire land from landlords, such that the state now owns about 80% of land in Singapore, and the state would acquire that land for what purpose? For the purpose mostly of developing public housing, but also other purposes like industrial development, public infrastructure, and so on. And then these flats would be sold at subsidized prices to Singaporeans. So it's a very powerful instrument, public housing. It's not just about providing a roof over people's heads. It's really an instrument of land and wealth redistribution. Over the years, at least certainly in the first 40, 50 years of Singapore's independence, public housing was seen also as an important tool for asset appreciation. Remember what I said about how Singapore doesn't have a comprehensive welfare state? So the means by which people would achieve retirement security was at least partially achieved through the appreciation of their public flats. And I'll show a chart later, and that has largely been the case, at least for the first 40 years of Singapore's development. The fifth point, which I think is crucial and most people miss, is that public housing and the provision of affordable, high-quality housing in Singapore is really a key plank, a key foundation of political legitimacy. During the social unrest in Hong Kong in 2019, there were some Singaporean commentators, not very thoughtful, I must say, who said that, Hong Kongers shouldn't be protesting and agitating for democracy. What you need is better public housing, right? What you need is good governance. And what those commentators conveniently forget is that since 1959, when we had democratic elections and universal suffrage in Singapore, the ruling party, the party that subsequently won the elections, PAP, and that's the only ruling party Singapore has had, this Lee Kuan Yew's party, campaigned on a platform of housing and jobs, affordable housing and good jobs for Singaporeans. So right from the get-go, right from 1959, housing has been central, has been a central instrument for obtaining, securing democratic legitimacy. So this idea that you can somehow have good governance and democratic demands can wait, well, even if it was true for Hong Kong, it was certainly not the case for Singapore. My argument in today's presentation is that while these multiple objectives were complementary in the early years and maybe even reinforce each other, increasingly, I think that there will be growing tension. Right? Some of these objectives might pull in different directions going forward. So I'll quickly talk through each of these objectives. The first is the centrality of home ownership. And this quote by Lee Kuan Yew expresses it very well, right? That if we let everybody own a home, their value goes up, the place is maintained. This is your point about how if you have rent control, landlords may have less incentive to maintain their flats. Singapore is also different in the sense that it is an independent sovereign state. And so this accountability that the state has to deliver on housing is quite critical. So in fact, our Hong Kong and Singapore starting points were quite similar in the early 60s, where there was shortage of housing, inadequate land for housing, overcrowding in the city center. And in both cases, Hong Kong and Singapore started slightly earlier in 1961 when the Housing Development Board was formed, Hong Kong after 67 with the then governor, McLehose. Our solution there was, let's provide affordable housing by the state, both a combination of rental and later home ownership. So you can see some pictures from Singapore in the 1950s and 60s. As I said earlier, this was a critical, public housing was, and home ownership in particular, was a critical plank of the PAP's, of the ruling party's election manifesto, right from 1959. The first statutory board it established was the Housing Development Board in 1960 to provide low-cost housing. And it really ramped up the development of public housing that had been started under the previous colonial administration. And in 2016, the HDB flats, account for about 82%, house 82% of the resident population in 23 HDB new towns and 3 estates. This is just a quick snapshot of the growth in population, as well as the proportion that live in public housing. It's hovered around just over 80%. The second objective, as I mentioned, is to facilitate integration, right? Both integration across different socioeconomic classes, as well as ethnic integration. So this is achieved in a variety of ways. First, in every HDB estate, or in most HDB estates, you get a mix of smaller flats, as well as rental flats that cater to low-income households, as well as larger flats that cater to middle-income and upper-middle-income households. Secondly, on the ethnic integration front, we have an ethnic integration policy, which again reflects how paternalistic the Singapore government can be. This is an instrument of social engineering, that we want every public housing estate to be a microcosm of Singapore society in terms of its ethnic diversity. Now, the third point is critical, and I think most people don't realize. They see public housing as just social policy, right? But it's really an instrument of land reform, which, as we all know, in this part of the world, is essential for broader economic development, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Land reform was, or even mainland China, was a very important strategy in distributing wealth, in creating incentives for people to produce, right? And so this point is absolutely crucial. Housing, right from the start, as I said, was seen as a central part of Singapore's economic development. It was enshrined, or rather, land was set aside for public housing from the very early years. Singapore does this process called concept planning. Once every 10 years, at a very high level, the government develops and publishes a concept plan, which sets out what plots of land will be set aside for what users. And there's always a heavy emphasis on housing, as you can see, both in the 1971 concept plan, as well as the one on the right. And the key instrument for doing that was a very powerful piece of legislation, which I think Hong Kong doesn't have, right? A Land Acquisition Act enacted in 1966, which meant that the state could acquire land pretty much forcibly, right? If you were the landowner and your land was being acquired, you might want to quibble with the state about the compensation you were going to get, but you cannot quibble about the fact that you cannot take this. Right? So this very powerful piece of legislation basically gave the state virtually unconstrained power to obtain land for purposes of public interest, right? To develop the land for public use and public interest. Then in 1964, the Home Ownership for the People scheme was introduced, again intended to give Singaporeans a stake in this country. Later on, from about 1970 onwards, as a way of encouraging people to, as a way of encouraging asset appreciation and allowing people to monetize, to benefit from that asset appreciation, public flats that people own could be resold, right, to be sold in the secondary market after the occupants had lived there for, I think, at least 5 years. So the first important institutional innovation was indeed the Land Acquisition Act, which gave the state largely unconstrained powers to obtain land for development for public use, public purpose. The second important institutional innovation was the state allowing Singaporeans to use their CPF. So CPF is the Central Provident Fund. Hong Kong has it, although Hong Kong has it at a much lower level, the Mandatory Provident Fund. So this is essentially savings for retirement. In the case of Singapore, the British had introduced this in, I think, 1964. In 1957. In 1955. And the PAP government, what it did after it took over in 1959 was to progressively expand it. First, increase the contribution rates, and second, also expand the users that Singaporeans could draw on the CPF for. And one of the key users that the CPF could finance was people could use it for financing their house purchases, whether public housing or private housing. So this was a very powerful, a second institutional arrangement, innovation, intended to facilitate or promote home ownership. And it was, of course, closely tied to retirement security. The idea that CPF is not just, since CPF is for retirement security and housing is part of retirement security, Singaporeans should be allowed to use their CPF savings to finance their house mortgages or their flat mortgages. Now, I just want to make this note about how housing is far more comprehensive. So this snapshot, the red dots show all the urban built-up areas in Singapore where there are residential developments, whether it's private or public. It's virtually all of Singapore, except for the central water catchment area in the middle, as well as on the western side, right, which is also water catchment and for military use. This is Hong Kong, right? It's much less densely developed. Although in the places where that are urbanized and developed, of course, it's much denser, right, than Singapore. Now, the fourth purpose is about asset appreciation and this being an instrument of retirement security. So as I mentioned earlier, that public flats and most people who live in Singapore, the 90% of people who live in Singapore who live in public flats do so as homeowners. So they are allowed to sell or resell their public flats after they've lived there for 5 years. So it's an important instrument of income and income mobility and housing upgrading. So as with your chart, we showed that since 2009, house prices or property prices in Hong Kong have increased by about threefold, by 120 to 380. In the case of Singapore, since 2009, so the index is, the 100 is 2009, public housing, the price of HDB resale flats has only increased by about 40%. So you also mentioned the sort of prudential interventions, macro-prudential interventions that both Singapore and Hong Kong introduced, I think, in 2012. Singapore, we started a bit earlier, 2010 onwards. That explained the sort of the slight moderation, stabilization of property prices. So those are indeed quite effective, as the Singapore experience shows. So yes, there has been asset appreciation, there has been price increases, but it's been far more sustainable. Right? Yours has been 3 times, ours has been 40%. So I think 40% over a decade is reasonable. It's not excessive. More recently, there have been efforts to kind of, as Singapore ages, measures to help older Singaporeans unlock their equity, right, in their flat. So whether it's the lease buyback scheme or the silver housing bonus, the idea is to help give these elderly citizens who may own a flat which is appreciating in value, or has appreciated in value, but you can't live off the flat, right? It doesn't generate a stream of income unless you rent it out. So think of these as various forms of reverse mortgages. And obviously Singapore is in a very different stage today than it was, say, 40 years ago, 50 years ago when the public housing program first started. 50 years ago, it was really about giving people a roof over their head, right? Giving them an asset, a wealth transfer. Now, it is really about helping them monetize, right, their housing assets and to use it to finance their retirement as Singapore ages. The other big aspect of public housing policy today is really about upgrading, right, and renewing older estates and older flats. The median age of public flats in Singapore today, I was surprised to find out quite recently, is more than 40. In other words, public flats in Singapore mostly are no longer new, right? And all public or most residential properties in Singapore are sold on 99-year leases, including public housing. So when you buy a flat from the HDB, it comes with a 99-year lease. After 5 years, you can sell it if you wish, but the lease is still 99 years, right? So we are coming to the point now where flats are going to be more than halfway into their of their 99-year lease. So that raises the question: what is going to happen to my flat when it hits the 99-year mark? Strictly speaking, the state has the authority, has the right, has the legislative power to take it all back without compensation. Now, that, of course, raises concerns about, well, you promised us asset appreciation, and this is going to be a source of retirement security. Isn't that a broken promise? And so the government has had to, even though the problem is not upon us until at least maybe 30 years, 40 years from now, the government has had to make some initial commitments as to what will happen to people's lives. So they've done so in a variety of ways. One, which has been in place since 1995, is to redevelop older estates, right? So government would go to, say, a set of flats which are, say, 30 years old, or 40 years old, 50 years old, and says, we're going to buy these flats back from you, and we're going to redevelop new public housing, more intensively, higher buildings, higher blocks, and you have the first right to get a subsidized flat in these newly developed SARS flats. It's been a very popular program in the places where it's been introduced because it gives those homeowners a second lease. Right? The first lease they had, which was aging already, they're going to have that replaced at a subsidized price with a new flat on a renewed lease of 99 years. So this has been rolled out in several estates, but obviously that can't be done universally. So more recently, the government has announced another scheme which has not been implemented yet. But the idea is that, right, it will, to help protect the residual value of flats and to upgrade those older flats. Those schemes were introduced. Finally, as I said, the political legitimacy point. And you can see this most clearly in the way housing always features as an election issue. And increasingly, since now almost everybody is housed, and almost everybody is housed in a public flat, the issue is no longer just about providing cheap, affordable housing. It's about providing quality housing and, of course, upgrading. So upgrading often features very prominently in elections. During elections where house prices have gotten out of reach, there's usually a strong reaction against the ruling party. So, for instance, you spoke about local community NIMBYism, right? Not just in Hong Kong, but in many cities around the world, homeowners feel that always resist new supply because that will bring down their property values. We don't see as much of that in Singapore. So remember what I said about the Singapore state being much less constrained. In Singapore, there isn't this NIMBYism that constrains the state in terms of providing affordable and providing new housing supply. So that helps. That helps with, there's a strong political consensus in Singapore that we need to provide affordable housing to make Singapore livable, to make Singapore attractive for, Singaporeans to start families, to get married, and so on. And these are other various innovations, I guess you could call them this, to allocate flats more efficiently, to get them built more quickly, and so on. I won't go into these details. So let me try to conclude on this point about political legitimacy. So these are some pictures of some of the newer developments. You can see they look almost indistinguishable, especially those at the bottom, right? They look almost indistinguishable from private housing. So every time I bring students to Singapore, we make it a point to visit some of these public housing. And people are amazed that this is public housing. And the reason that we did, the HDB did this was something called these DBSS programs, right? DBS. So they engage the private sector. So the HDB is still the developer, is still the one providing the subsidies. But in terms of design, build or construction, and sale of and price setting is done by the private sector. The rules governing eligibility, governing subsidy is still set by the HDB. HDB still bears the risk of development, but in terms of the design features and other aspects, it's undertaken by the private sector, and that's really raised the, I guess, raised the quality of public housing or public flats in Singapore in recent years. So maybe I'll pause there and I'll be happy to take questions along with Professor Cheung.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard, and this is truly very impressive. And now the floor is open. Actually, we have collected 3 questions already, and so Professor Cheung, can you please? I think the first one is directly to you.
Mm-hmm.
The middle class cannot apply for public housing, and then they pay high rents but no rental subsidy. So what can the government do to help the middle class?
Well, I think the problem that we are facing now is the price level of private housing is beyond what many middle class people can afford. And put aside the question of the size of the unit. So in other words, either the government can be very effective in terms of suppressing private housing prices, or government has to provide more so-called middle-class housing in the public sector, such as the HKUST. And in fact, if we look at the eligibility criteria of HKUST in terms of income level, if I remember correctly, by the time I left government, around 70% of the so-called middle-class bracket people, they are eligible. The question is, we don't have sufficient supply. Not to mention public rental housing, even HKUST green form subsidized scheme, we don't have enough supply. So ultimately, the question is supply. Without supply, even if you have rent control, at the moment the government is considering rent control for subdivided units. I don't think that will be those units that affect most middle class people. But if you have across the board rent control, I think that will have a lot of consequential economic consequences, apart from the quality of housing stock, whether you can enable a lot of private tenancy in the market, because we still suffer from the overall supply shortage. So you cannot get away from the supply question. But of course, even if we are able to overcome some of the hurdles at the moment, I think it will still take time. But if people are able to see the end of a tunnel, so to speak, let's say if people will feel more confident that in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time, housing supply will improve quite substantially, maybe they can afford to wait. Maybe they won't jump into the market so quickly, because if you have a lot of people jumping into the market very quickly within a short period, that will actually push up the prices. So I think we are in a very delicate and very challenging situation.
Right, great, thank you. The second one is from Professor Ming Chu, and so basically he was asking about the vested interest and the actors, the nimbism problem. Who are the political actors behind the scene?
Now, in the case of Hong Kong, I'm not pointing to particular cases per se. I'm just looking at it in terms of a conceptual situation. Obviously, for developers, they would want to have to see prices at not at a low level, but a relatively high level, but not so high so that people can't afford. Otherwise, they can't sell. So, but still, I mean, it's quite natural that you can see that there is a developer interest there. And that is what Donald has said. Once you become a landlord, you would like to see prices to remain at a higher level. You want your asset to appreciate. When you're a renter, you want rent to come down. So this is human nature. But of course, in terms of government, now you have to factor in the developers' interest and landowners, landlords' interest as part of the situation. Whether you like it or not, this is part of the situation. But how do you ensure that you can overcome resistance in particular cases? We have a planning process. We have a system where we need to consult the local people. You cannot get rid of all this entirely. You have to have a firm commitment to develop more new land. And I suppose the audience will be quite surprised that in the case of Singapore, in fact, if you look at the whole of Singapore Island, a lot of areas have been developed into residential areas. In the case of Hong Kong, only 7%, single digit, 7% of Hong Kong's land mass is for residential. Of course, the geography differs, but I think the Singapore government has gone a much longer way in terms of developing new land. Reclamation, I think about a quarter of Singapore built-up areas is reclaimed land. So in Hong Kong, I think in the previous administration, we've always said, why can't we just find another 1%? The 1% question, because at the moment we have 7% of Hong Kong's land devoted to residential. If you can get an extra 1%, Hong Kong situation, housing situation will improve quite substantially. But how can you persuade different communities to come around and say, okay, we have got this challenges, no pain, no gain, therefore we are willing to give some way. And if society is more supportive of government, if we have a slightly higher level of trust in the government, maybe it's easier. So we are caught not just in the economic situation, the land supply situation, but also, of course, in a kind of political situation.
Right. So the third question basically was asking about the land acquisition. Has the Hong Kong government truly tried the best to acquire land? And if not, why? And the legislation offers a similar, advantage, but why there's so little progress?
We have a similar legislation as the Land Acquisition Act in Singapore. We call it Land Resumption Ordinance, where government can resume land, even private land, but on, first of all, for public interest. Okay, maybe public infrastructure, maybe public housing. That is public interest, and also with due regard to fair compensation. And we have also to remember that property right is enshrined in the basic law as a fundamental right. So government must have very strong reason to take away land from private owners. Okay, so you have to prove that this is for public interest. You have to prove that you have made due, fair, appropriate compensation. Now, in the past, actually, a lot of cases of land resumption cases will involve landowners challenging government's decision and even going to the court, judicial review. So government must have a very strong case to persuade the court that this is indeed for public interest. But public housing, I think, would be regarded as a legitimate condition as far as public interest is concerned. But still, we need to go through a process, the planning process itself, the negotiation with landowners about compensation, whether our compensation package is sort of catching up with the latest expectations, the latest situation, and to spend time in rather lengthy judicial review process. And all this, of course, takes time.
Yeah. So Donald, as a Singapore citizen and currently Hong Kong resident, what is your take on this question?
The next one?
Yeah, no, the third one. So land acquisition and Hong Kong, what can Hong Kong learn?
Yeah, so I agree with Professor Cheung. It's not just the fact that Hong Kong also has similar legislation. It's also what I guess political scientists or public policies call your authorizing environment. Right? Singapore has a much stronger consensus around the need to provide affordable, good quality public housing. So that creates a very conducive authorizing environment for government to take these very efficient and powerful measures to acquire land for public housing, to develop them quickly, to sell them quickly. I mean, I live across a public housing flat in Cheung. So it's a beautiful flat, certainly by public housing standards. But I was surprised it took so long before it got occupied, right? When I moved into my flat about half a year ago, it seemed ready for occupation. But only now are people starting to move in 6 months later. So in Singapore, this would have been, this would be very surprising. So the authorizing environment, so the point I was trying to make earlier about, when we look at we look at these differences and we say, oh, therefore the Singapore state is more competent, more efficient, more effective. Yes, to a point, right? But you also have to understand the larger context and the authorizing or enabling environment. Singapore is a far more supportive environment for developing public housing quickly and getting it out, to people as fast as possible. Whereas in Hong Kong, I think the government faces a lot more structural, bureaucratic constraints. Whether rightly or wrongly, I'm not judging which is a superior system. It's just the way both governments have evolved.
So the next question basically attributes the Hong Kong-Singapore differences to political leadership.
Yeah.
And then, so what are your views, both of you?
Yeah, so I'll make exactly the same point, right? As human beings, we have this leadership myth that if we see differences in outcomes, one better, one inferior, we are very quick to attribute it to, the idea that there was a heroic leader. So in Singapore's case, the heroic leader or the messiah is Lee Kuan Yew. I would resist this very human tendency to attribute everything to a single leader. First, there's the role of history, right? So as I briefly alluded to in my slides, the HDB took on the HDB, the Housing Development Board in Singapore was not started on a clean slate. There was an original, during British colonial times, there was already something called the Singapore Improvement Trust, which had conceptualized public housing in Singapore. Their problem was slow implementation. So when the PAP came into power, their election promise was we'll develop affordable housing quickly. We'll solve the housing crisis quickly. And so, we really need to look at both the historical context as well as the institutional environment. And so right from the start, whereas in Hong Kong, public housing is seen as a far more residual form of social welfare. It's seen as one, so for instance, eligibility in Hong Kong, if you were somebody asked that question, if you're middle income or middle class in Hong Kong, you would not be eligible for public housing, right? Because your income would have exceeded the threshold. In Singapore, the threshold is much higher, maybe 4 times higher than Hong Kong, right? The household income threshold per month for Singapore works out to about 60,000 Hong Kong dollars. Sorry, 60,000 Hong Kong dollars, which I think is 3 or 4 times higher than or 4 times higher, or maybe even more than the threshold. So in other words, Singapore is a much more universalist, right? Almost universalist, more inclusive concept of public housing. As this is something which we want. This is almost like a national experience that we want all Singaporeans to go through, right? Eventually, you may upgrade, move to a private flat, but this is part of the Singapore experience, living in a public flat. Whereas in Hong Kong, the idea, this goes back to this idea of the Hong Kong government, not being fairly laissez-faire, positive, not interventionism, only when there are clear market failures and only when the market cannot serve the needs of the really poor, then the state has to intervene. Singapore has no such qualms. Right? Singapore never pretended, the Singapore government never ever said it was laissez-faire. right from the start, it was intrusive, interventionist, and paternalistic. And he makes no apologies for being all those things. So I think people have to understand the institutional and ideological context to in this case, public housing. And the institutional and ideological context in Singapore is such that the state has to play this very activist, almost certainly paternalistic, and highly, interventionist, right? It sees public housing as a tool for social engineering, for creating the sort of society and citizens it wants.
So Professor Cheung, what is your analysis on this point?
Well, I follow up on what Donna just said. I think in terms of leadership, of course, we have to look at leadership at two levels. First, the leader as an individual, okay, his or her personal qualities, connectedness to the population, so on and so forth, and then the institutional context. I think, as what Don has said, Singapore from day one, the government has taken up this rather sort of interventionist, intrusive role for national interest, and the government is not shy of intervening. In the case of Hong Kong, I think there's always this so-called philosophy or myth sometimes, the government should not intervene because it was believed that the private market can do better than the bureaucracy. Even though, actually, if we look into the past decades, 1970s, 1980s, actually we see a lot of cases where government did intervene. For example, in the 80s, when some private banks went bankrupt, government took over the banks or asked HSBC to take over the banks for a while. So government was not shy from intervening, but still, whenever government intervened in the past, government say, okay, we are forced to intervene. Actually, the market will do better. Now, with that kind of mentality, the government will not develop good tools or expertise in intervening. So whenever government intervenes, then there might be some hiccups, and because the government will try to get away, get out of the intervening situation as quick as possible afterwards. Okay? So we are not as forthcoming. Now, I'm not suggesting that the bureaucracy is better than the market or vice versa, but I think we have to recognize that there are both market failures and bureaucratic failures. So you have to sort of assess the pros and cons, the risks and the advantages of intervention or non-intervention. But the context is so different. And therefore, in the case of Hong Kong, if you look at the statistics, now you may argue that Hong Kong has evolved over the last few decades naturally by default with some intervention in terms of public rental housing, HOS. But even up to now, with that kind of intervention, since the 1970s, the McLeish years in public housing development, our current situation is still slightly less than half in public housing, slightly more than half in private housing compared to the Singapore case. And that is a result of natural evolution, sort of the part of our DNA path dependence result.
History,
So that is the institutional context. And it will take time both for the government and the bureaucracy and the community to come out of that kind of traditional mindset. Because if government does too much or if government is too active in intervention, there might be backlash from the community. I remember back in 1999 or 98, when government decided to fight the speculators, the global speculators, when government created buy some government company stocks in the market, later on creating this trackers fund, government was widely condemned by some of our economists and the market for intervention. And I remember the former financial secretary, Anthony Leung, when he took his office, I think it was in 2000 or around 2001, and when he delivered his first budget speech, he mentioned that he would like to see the role of government as a market enabler. Now that was the word he used, market enabler. He was widely criticized And then some commentators suggested that he was trying to introduce central planning. Now, that was the market at the time. When Donald Cheung was the chief executive, 2006, after an economic summit, and then he said, well, from now on, positive non-interventionism would not be the guiding principle. He was widely criticized, and he was forced to publish a long commentary to explain what is meant by positive non-interventionism, and that previous colonial financial secretaries actually also was willing to intervene in order to explain the situation. Now, this is the community mentality. So in other words, at certain points, the community will want intervention, housing maybe, as far as public housing is concerned. But once they have acquired the property, maybe as landlords, they will not like government to intervene too much. So we have this kind of mixed reaction.
Maybe one way of illustrating the point that both Anthony and I are making is to compare Singapore and Hong Kong in another field, public transport. So in public housing, it's mostly a state responsibility. In both our cities, public housing is a state responsibility. So the Singapore state, I do think, is more organized, has got a more supportive, enabling environment, ideology, history, all help in creating an environment where the Singapore state is very competent in delivering public housing. When it comes to public transport, which is in both our cities also done mostly by the private sector, this is reverse. Right? Hong Kong has far more developed, or at least started much earlier with this idea of a transit-oriented development, and the MTR system is far more developed. In fact, sometimes you get the funny situation where it's not funny, actually, it's by design. The MTR station is already open before you have public flats and residents. In Singapore, it's oftentimes public transport, or at least mass rapid transit development comes after housing development. It's housing first, then the transit. In Hong Kong, it's reversed, right? So I think it reflects, as Professor Cheung was saying, the very different starting points, different histories, as well as different ideological dispositions that both our governments have. Here, there is a legacy of, the market does it better. In Singapore, there's no presumption that the market will do it better.
All right, so the next question is directed to Professor Low, and inviting you to comment on the living conditions for foreign workers in Singapore.
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this reflects state priorities and state capacity, and whether it wants to even acknowledge the problem. So, if you visit Singapore, besides visiting the public housing estates and saying what a great job the Singapore government has done, please keep a lookout also for the invisible segments of Singapore society. And by that, I refer to our large population of migrant workers, close to 1 million of them. Right? And they generally live in compared to Singaporeans who mostly live in very good public housing, public flats. Most migrant workers whom the state considers as transient. I mean, individually, they may be transient, they may be there for 3 years, 5 years, whatever. But as a collective, they are pretty much a permanent feature of Singapore society. And yet, they are not acknowledged as being a permanent part of Singapore society. I mean, they have no rights of residency, mainly for political reasons. They cannot bring their wife or children. So it's very much like migrant workers in China, in the mainland. When you go to a major city like Shanghai or Beijing, you have no rights of residency. You can't bring your child there to Shanghai or Beijing to be educated in the city. So Singapore has that set of policies too for these low-skilled, low-wage migrant workers. And their housing conditions, I mean, I think I'll be very kind and say, well, they're not great, right, compared to public housing. And so, for instance, I think what spurred the participant to ask that question was, people would know that in Singapore, which has generally done a fantastic job in containing COVID-19, yet has a very high number of infected cases, confirmed cases. Almost all of those cases were foreign workers in these very cramped, crowded migrant worker dormitories. And it reflects, right? So why have we done such a poor job there? Because A, it was not a top state priority. B, these people have no political power. They don't vote. Right? C, they are not going to ever be long-term residents. right? D, very importantly, it goes back to our point about institutional arrangements. The HDB is not responsible for the housing condition or housing foreign workers. HDB is only concerned for housing citizens, right? And to some extent permanent residents. So who looks after the housing needs of these migrant workers? Their employers.
Supposed to be that.
And of course, employers being private sector, they're going to make sure that, you know, I spend as little as possible. And I'm not going to pay more than necessary to house my migrant workers.
Yeah. Before we close, actually, personally, I do have a question to Professor Cheung, because at the beginning in your analysis, you said, you know, seeking a solution from the mainland is not a viable option. But at the same time, this Greater Bay Area, you know, it's no longer just a vision. Lots of, you know, progress has been done, although it's, you know, has been slowed in recent years because of the pandemic. But, you know, lots of, you know, new initiatives. Don't you think that Greater Bay, this grand vision might provide a solution for long-term housing problem in Hong Kong?
Not in a specific way. In other words, you cannot expect a local problem, a domestic problem such as housing, to be solved by your regional neighbors. But of course, if you have this Bay Area concept, you have the population moving around. Now, if it proves that moving or relocating to other parts of the Bay Area, Hong Kong is part of the Bay Area, if you think that relocation actually serves you better as an individual, whether in terms of work, in terms of residential condition, in terms of leisure, whatever, then you have people moving around to the extent that population pressure then eases in Hong Kong. Of course, that helps. But my point made earlier was you cannot expect a domestic problem to be solved by others. I mean, we still have some lines to be drawn. In other words, if Shenzhen faces a housing problem, you could expect Hong Kong to say, okay, let's use some Hong Kong land. I mean, so there's still some boundary. Maybe I would also like to take this opportunity here to make a further couple of points about what we have just discussed. I think in order to solve the housing problem, first of all, we must focus on what the real problems are. And in my view, the real problems are supply, planning and supply, because planning decides how much supply you can get. And we have to try to get away from some myths, because the myths will prevent you from actually focusing on the problem. Now, nowadays, it's common that some views in our community say, okay, look at the 1970s, MacLehose has done a great job. He's a hero, so launching this 10-year housing problem. I remember when I was a student activist in the early 1970s, when MacLehose first launched his housing program, and then what other policies, new measures that MacLehose introduced, we as student activists at the time, we said, MacLehose, whatever he does, it's just window dressing. It's not sufficient. It's not going to the root of a problem. That's what those people going through his era. But of course, I'm not trying to make that a point here. But my point is rather that if MacLehose was put as the chief executive today, I don't think he could do what he achieved in the 1970s.
I agree.
MacLehose introduced the country park ordinance. He introduced in Hong Kong the country park concept. Before that, there was no country park. He could introduce that by one stroke. Okay, administrative decision, because at that time it was a colonial government. A lot of restrictions on planning, on reclamation or whatever, were a result of a reformist era of the colonial administration. They were not there in the 70s or 80s when Hong Kong began to develop. We tried a lot of new things because there was no hindrance. So we can try a lot of new things. Let me use the example of the new airport. The current airport, the Cheung Airport, it was planned in the 80s, and then work started in the 1990s. When work started, because that involved a lot of reclamation, we did not have the same stringent set of restrictions as today. So my point is, if the new airport was not built in the early 90s, but built today, I don't think it could be built because it would not conform with the current planning restrictions. So we have to look at a different time context apart from historical context. Medley was able to do a lot of things in his days because he did not face so many concerns. And about an earlier comment or question asked by the audience, whether public housing is sort of takes more time than private housing or private development. My response is, in terms of building, construction, the same. Because the housing authority in Hong Kong also contract out the job. It's the private builders who actually does the construction. About 3 years, 3.5 years, depending on the site condition. But it's the pre-construction process. The planning process will take a long time. For public housing, normally within government, the land made available to the housing authority for public housing is not spade ready. In other words, the housing authority, once getting the land, still need to go through the consultation, district consultation process, the planning process, sometimes involving rezoning the land use purpose. Whereas for sale of land to a private developer, the land is already cleared. So once the private developer got the land, they could start construction almost immediately. So that makes a difference.
And just now, when you were analyzing the old and the new, the current situation and the old situation, you said, the old governor had much less restrictions and so on. So would these restrictions mainly technocratic restrictions or the restrictions from political legitimacy?
I think political legitimacy does count, and more today than several decades ago. I'm not suggesting that legitimacy was not an issue in the 70s or even 80s. But the government's hands were not as tied by different institutional or social context constraints as now. And sometimes a government can proceed more easily because of past records. I mean, if you look at the colonial administration back in the 70s, when it started reform in the 70s, at first people looked at those reforms with a lot of skepticism. For example, the setting up of the ICAC. When ICAC was set up, people would suggest, okay, this is just window dressing. ICAC would last for no more than a few years, and then things will be back to square one. Corruption will be as rampant as before. But because the measures were able to stick, and some years passed, and then people began to say, okay, maybe this is for real. And then you have past record, and then people will have more trust. It's like Singapore, right? The PAP. People know that, okay, the PAP, if the PAP has promised you to do something, that will be delivered. Now, Hong Kong actually, before 1997, the government was able to develop that kind of impression. Government may not agree to do a lot of things, so government may not concede, but once government has accepted some ideas from the community, that will be followed through. Now, but of course, in the last few years in Hong Kong, because of all these political anxieties, trust in the government has gone down. Of course, it's not just Hong Kong, but everywhere in the world, but Hong Kong is more acute situation. Then, even when government tries to do good things, you have all kinds of skepticism, hostility, and therefore sometimes it does not enable the government to go far enough. There's a lot of hesitation here and there. I think that's make the situation more complex.
Thanks. One last question from Dr. Chris Hartley, our colleague, about the consequences of high housing price, because that seems to have reduced mobility. And the university graduates cannot afford even down payment. So what are your views? It becomes a political problem.
Yeah, I think it's already a problem, isn't it? The sense of no prospects of ever owning a home. I mean, I speak to some young Hong Kongers, and So, and I think it's driving also, I mean, it's not just the unrest and the national security law, but it's also a major source of, where's my future going to be, right? So I mean, it is really, I mean, I don't know if people realize how extreme it is. 20, the median multiple you showed, right? Median house price over median income. Of 20, it's off the charts.
Off the chart.
It's off the charts, right? I think the next one is 10 or something, right? In Singapore, it's about 5. During the boom years, maybe it was closer to 6. So even in the worst of times in Singapore, when there was a property boom, it was no more than 6 or, and it's the fact that it's 20 here, it means it's pretty much uncontrollable, right? I mean, the good thing is it's stabilized. Maybe the pandemic came at the right time, I don't know. But even despite the pandemic, it has not come down significantly. So it means that beyond cyclical factors, right, there is also deep structural factors, which is Anthony's point about, right? Inherently, there is a tremendous shortage of a tremendous lack of supply. So yeah, Chris is absolutely right. It impinges on people's sense of hope, optimism, of expectations of social mobility. And when those sentiments turn negative, that I don't think I'll do better than my parents or my grandparents, then it's a recipe for discontent, right? A recipe for maybe even unrest.
The question raised by Chris touched upon the younger generation problems. So Donald, you have taught Singaporean students, and now you're currently teaching Hong Kong students. So when you compare both, the same cohort of students in both cities, have you really observed the difference in their separate momentum? And for example, Singaporean students are less cynical and so on. Have you observed that difference?
Yeah, definitely. Singaporean students by far are more optimistic than Hong Kong students. I think Singaporean students generally think that they will do as well, if not better, than their parents' generation. They have confidence that they would be able to afford, at least for their first property, they will be able to afford it by the age of 30. Right, and it would not be a big financial imposition, especially since public housing is within reach, right? It's affordable, and with all the government grants. So I always tell young Singaporeans, don't worry so much about, right, getting on the housing ladder, because it will be there. It's available. You don't have to rush to get it. Whereas young people here feel a great deal more anxiety, more stress. It occupies, and therefore they're a lot less optimistic, a lot more pessimistic about their own future economic prospects and housing prospects. And it's not helpful, right? Because at the time when we are trying to give people a sense of hope and optimism, and this is a major drag. Housing is a major, I wouldn't say it is the only thing that occupies young Hong Kongers' mind, but it's certainly something that does not give them any reason to be optimistic about the future. I don't know whether, Anthony, you agree with that.
Yes, I think Hong Kong has, housing is perhaps, first of all, is number one problem in Hong Kong, most acute social problem. And in terms of housing affordability, the situation in Hong Kong is perhaps most acute among big cities in the world.
Yeah.
Now, the medium multiple is 20.7, according to the latest Demographia survey. Last year, it was 20.8, so well over 20. The next one after Hong Kong is Toronto. Vancouver, 13. Okay, London, 8.6. So you can see the strong contrast. So we are facing a real shortage, and this real shortage in supply, unfortunately, for some people who can gain a lot of profit, fortunately, against very solid demand, despite the recent political and social unrest or COVID-19 %. So we must do something about shortage. And in terms of expectation, I mean, I can well imagine that in Singapore, a young person will say, okay, I can wait for a few years because they have this build-to-order scheme. I can wait 3 years, 5 years, definitely I'll get this. Once I'm eligible, if I am permanent resident, I'm a national, I'm eligible, I'm 35 years old, I can get it. But in the case of Hong Kong, now I will use the HOS, Home Ownership Scheme, as example. In terms of eligibility, the current income level, asset level, covers roughly 70% of Hong Kong's tenant population, those living in private housing. Okay, 70%. So that's quite a wide range. These people, including middle class, not just young middle class, but middle class, they're eligible. But being eligible is not the same as being able to get it, because every time there's not sufficient supply, you have to depend on your luck or whether your number is drawn. So if Hong Kong can come to a situation, very optimistic, if we can come to a situation where the government feels more comfortable with a steady supply of new units, government can afford to give people more expectation. Then the situation might change. But unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think any government, despite good intentions, would be daring enough to say, okay, we are able to commit to so many units per year, because the government cannot commit because of the lack of supply.
Okay, all right. So perfect time control. Thank you so much, for Professor Cheung and Professor Low for their, great talk. And the policy dialogue has been turned into a Singapore-Hong Kong dialogue conversations, and both places offer fantastic textbook knowledge for public housing and housing policy and so on. So I believe the audience, including myself, have learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.